When you look off the pitch, it's the most damning thing you'll ever see. And most people don't look because they just want their team to win 3 points on a Saturday. But when you do look off the pitch, there's a damning gap, a gaping hole. It seems like they just want to bury it. Right, bury all of that. Let's not talk about it. Let's do these soft things. And, in some ways you can see why. I mean, look, footballers, wonderful as they are, they just want to play the game, right? So if you are leaders in the game, then you don't have to engage with them because they don't want to play the game. You don't think you have to engage in the strategic side and, as I say, the risks and the opportunities. So we come along and go, well, okay, let's have the conversation about strategy, risk, and opportunities. They go, oh, the bloody hell, we've never had to do this. We don't want to do it, right? And that's the worrying bit. They struggle with this idea of actually this might be useful for them. And I say to people, we may not meet in the middle. Because, we recognize this is often about evolution rather than revolution, but at least start the conversation.
Welcome to the Goal Assist podcast. My name is Joshua Price. If you don't know what we're trying to achieve here, I'm trying to get you closer to executives across the football industry. We do that through this podcast, but we also have a community. If you'd like to network with the guests inside this podcast, use the link below, join our community, and you can join myself and all the previous guests we've had on in community calls. We will answer your questions directly, and it'd be a great opportunity to network with myself and all the guests that we've had on. Today, I'm joined by Delro Canaldi, Executive Director and Co-Founder of the Black Footballers Partnership. It's a pleasure to have you on. Thank you for joining me.
Thank you for having me, Joshua. Or should I call you Josh? Much less.
Yes, Josh is absolutely fine. Right.
Lovely seeing you.
What was the moment where you realised that the Black Footballers Partnership needed to exist, and why do you feel that you were the one to help make it happen?
Gosh, you make me sound messianistic. Look, football's one of the greatest games on earth, if not the greatest sport on earth. We all love it. I love it. You love it. We love seeing those guys and increasingly now women, girls on that pitch, enjoying stroking that ball, putting it in the net, stopping it from going in the net. It's great fascination to me, my kids, your nephews, your uncles, your aunts. Everyone watches it, both here and around the world. And I've loved playing it as a kid, played as a schoolboy, for numerous clubs. And it's just in my bones, right? It's just part and parcel of me. But, as I've grown older, sadly, we all grow older, and you do look at the game and you think to yourself, gosh, can I see myself in that game? Can I see my friends and family in that game? And it's one of the most diverse games you can ever imagine on the pitch. Black, white. Now we have an Asian manager at Maidstone. We have joint camaraderie, the most international of changing rooms. And then you look off the pitch. And when you look off the pitch, it's the most damning thing you'll ever see. And most people don't look because they just want their team to win 3 points on a Saturday, or as it was last night when Liverpool played Newcastle on a Monday, right? But when you do look off the pitch, there's a damning gap, a gaping hole between those who are putting the ball in the net last night, and you just want to see the players put the ball in the net. But actually, if you look at their ethnicity, 5 goals were scored and 4 of them were black, right? But then you look at the dugout and you look in the executive boxes and you look at the ownership, and the diversity sadly falls away. So it's because of that I kind of got involved in looking and seeing what we could do to improve the game, to in fact grow the game. Because, 20 odd years ago, in fact, 1992, when the Premier League was formed, only 16% of the players were black. 20 years on from that, it was 32%. And now our data tells you it's 43%. So when you look at the data for on the pitch and you look at the data off the pitch, you go, gosh, surely the game needs to do something about this. Surely the game wants to do something about this. So you asked the question about, what drove us to set up this new organization. It's only been around for just over 3 years, called the Black Footballers Partnership. During COVID, we had more time on our hands, and I'm a bit more of a strategist, been involved in the political sphere, the corporate sphere, the charitable sphere, looking at trying to influence change. And I was introduced to a number of footballers, former players and current players, who were concerned by the lack of diversity off the pitch, both in coaching roles and leadership roles. And somehow the two groups came together, and at the back end of 2019, beginning of 2020, we then formed this organization called Black Footballers Partnership.
I think it's a great background, and I do agree is an area where like I said, we'll get into the statistics more maybe later on. But when you do look at those statistics, it is frightening the differences between on and off the pitch and what the opportunities available for black players once they finish their playing career. Why do you believe that this isn't something where the existing football authorities haven't brought this structure and pushed this issue to the forefront for clubs? Why do you feel like it needed this external organisation to really push for change?
I mean, I've met probably most of the senior leaders now in football, and they're well-meaning. You know, they'll come on podcasts like this, and they'll give you some wonderful messaging about what they're doing. You know, no room for racism, providing some form of funding for Kick It Out, and so on. But they don't look at it through a strategic business lens. So they don't understand actually that if we invest in our talent, who are our employees, it will potentially grow the game off the pitch, and it will allow us as a game to be the global phenomena that we are at present, but actually be even more of a global phenomenon. So when it looks at the governance issues, when it looks at regulation, when it looks at business development, when it looks at sponsorship, when it looks at all those issues, it somehow manages to miss out the black perspective, even though they're milking those players on the pitch, paying them well, don't get me wrong, but they're milking them on the pitch to not then give them opportunities off the pitch. So what you end up with, and we're going to come onto the data, is people recruiting from their own networks and their own support groups and people that look like them, people that sound like them. And that's fascinating, right? Because they're executives who only recruit talent for the boardroom, they say. We recruit the best, and therefore we achieve this by recruiting the best. And that's obvious on the pitch, right? You recruit the best players. And as I said at the beginning, Premier League, 16% when it was first founded, now 43%. They recruit the best from all around the world, and they just so happen to be increasingly black. So we want the best people off the pitch as well. And, you know, our data tells us that they're not recruiting the best people off the pitch. And we'll see, you know, there'll be a spate of, and sadly, people will lose their jobs in the coaching and management world. And let's see who replaces them. And in the boardroom, there'll be a lot of talk about, yeah, we need more diversity, but they never seem to get it over the line somehow. In fact, it seems increasingly to look like them rather than actually that diversity of thought, that knowledge that comes from having a wider group of people that will help the game grow. So governance is lost, right? Leadership potential is lost. And I think that's where the big chasm is. And that's why I think the wonderful, you know, initially started by Tracy Crouch, the creation of an independent football regulator, that kind of helps because it throws a bit of sunlight on the way the game is run, how it engages with fans, what the end outcomes are, who benefits from that. But of course, that's just the creation of a body. What drives it culturally? What will its policies be? What will its procedures be? Who will be the people who are driving change, and not just change for change's sake, but to move the game on to grow it? And I think those are like the bigger challenges that we face. Creating institutions is one thing. You have the FA, you have the Premier League, you have the English Football League, you have all these institutions. But in terms of driving that change for real benefit for fans and those who are increasing the benefit on the ground, black players, we're not seeing that.
It's an area in which needs a stronger spotlight shown on it because, like you say, everybody wants success on the pitch, and it's obvious that having a wide recruitment pool and making sure you're recruiting the best of the best, regardless of race or ethnicity, is shown to have positive results. What we don't see as clearly is what happens off the pitch because it's not as clear for everybody to see, and shining that spotlight on the realities of diversity off the pitch, I think is something that's really important. You also touched on how you've managed to connect with a lot of the executives across the industry, whether it's been governing bodies, obviously the new independent regulator. Has
Yeah.
there been any doors that have been more difficult to open, and what challenges have you faced making these connections?
So let me give you an example of a challenge we've had. Look, the FA's been around for a long time, right? And for good or ill, you know, it's seen a national team which has reached various finals and almost won it, which would be the first time since 1966. So if that's their barometer for success, some people might say they're nearly there, they nearly ticked a box. But, you know, running a business is more than just trying to win a game on the pitch, right? You've got to have the structures in place, the people in place, the policies in place, make sure the financial model's correct and so on, and actually have leadership at the top that understands what it's like to bring talent through and not just say things, not just be about marketing, but actually about measurable actions. A few years ago, the FA launched what was then called its diversity scheme, its voluntary code for getting people through. And it had numbers attached for how it wants to achieve this. And, people applauded it at the time, and we thought, okay, let's see what happens. And some years later, they reported on it. When they reported on it, they said, look at the data. We're exceeding expectations, they said. And they wanted a pat on the back. Well, that's how it appeared. And it took an organization like ours, not really resourced, but working with some of the best academics around the world to crunch the data. And when we crunched the data, the reality was it was failing. Their code was failing. And instead of accepting that it was failing, it then did another marketing spin and it said, we need to move to a mandatory code. And we get that because mandatory code helps, right? Getting data directly from the clubs, you change the FA rules and so on. But sometimes you've got to admit your mistakes in order to be able to move forward. So instead of marketing that it was exceeding expectations and then for an organization like ours to find it wasn't, what they should have done is embraced us and said, look, we're clearly not doing something right. How can we move together to change this? Because we want the game to be a better game than when we started looking at this. So now they've introduced a mandatory code and the clubs have now reported, and they've done it in such an ad hoc way that it's very difficult to gauge who's doing well and who's not doing well. So you're now in a system where the clubs are doing what they're supposed to do, but the data is pretty opaque and you can't make sense of exactly what's happening in terms of recruiting off the pitch. But we say to the game, as I said, I think 99.9% of the people I meet love the game and they have the best intent, certainly in words. But we say to the game, the key word is in that partnership and collaboration and being able to take criticism. If someone looked at the books of the FA and the Premier League and the Premier League clubs and so on, and they found there was some issues there, they did a proper audit, the game would then work with the right authorities to get themselves into a better position. But it leads to questions as to how seriously they take these issues in terms of equity and so on, and inclusion and growth in terms of the next 5-10 years, because that's where they're getting their playing staff from. It leads to questions as to whether they are serious about it. If it takes a little organization like ours, not funded by the game, who then has to interrogate the data and then has to say, but hang on, you're saying one thing and doing another. And that's quite preposterous, really. But I think, look, I went to the PFA Awards last week, had some good conversations with people at senior levels in the game. There is an intent to do things differently. It seems they want to work with us. We want to work with them. I mean, we've got players who just love the game, comment on the game, household names. And they just want to see the game grow. They want opportunities for themselves, but also for the young kids coming through, right? I mean, last night we saw young Rio score for Liverpool, the final goal, make it 3-2, 16. What will the opportunities be like for him in 20 years' time? A few years ago, it was Raheem Sterling who was coming through. And now he's probably in his penultimate contract or very close. Forgive me, Raheem, if I'm putting you on the retirement pool too soon. But what will be the opportunities for an equivalent of Raheem? And we've seen it in past generations where players have come through and they cannot get opportunities. And I think, what we want is that relationship with the game where they invest in, like most businesses, they invest in their employees and they provide that opportunity for the pipeline that already exists. So in the case of football, it's very clear who the performers are on the pitch because you can see it from the data, who scores and who stops the goals going in. But it's also clear now that a lot more players, including black players, are getting their coaching badges and have the experience of playing. And they're ready. So the pipeline's there, but they're not getting that opportunity. And when they do, they're at the bottom of the rung, too often at the bottom of the rung. So it just tells you there are serious structural issues in the game. Whatever your view is on taking the knee, as we'll probably see in October, nice message. If it unites the fans and it makes the fans feel better, great. If it unites the players and makes the players feel better, great. But like all of us, if you've got children, if you've got nephews and cousins and mothers and fathers, you want them to have a job. You want them to have a standard of living in order to provide for their family members and so on. And I think every footballer, as much as people might think they earn loads, what's wrong with them? They deserve that opportunity because they retire at 30, 35 if they have a full career. Then they've still got 30 years of their lives. I mean, what do you want them to do? Nothing? Stare at the wall? Walk into a pub or a club and reminisce about what they did 20 years ago? Give them an opportunity like everyone else. The data suggests they deserve that.
I absolutely agree. The report you did with Szymanski,
Yes.
you see, was an absolute game changer. What were the most shocking elements to come out of the report, and did that report change your approach in any way to what you were doing?
Look, why are we doing the data? Why are we doing these reports? Why are we working with world-leading academics like Stefan? We're also working with academics in Amsterdam, working with them in Liverpool and so on. And it's because it's the language of the boardroom, right? I mean, I've worked in strategy now for a long period of time. I've been on boards, I'm currently on boards, and I see how boards, owners, leadership groups make decisions. And emotion plays its part, clearly, when we're watching the game, but actually it's business and business decisions that drive outcomes. So we thought, right, let's get the data to help the game understand why we're doing this. Why are we coming together to advocate for fairness in football based on results and competition, just like it is on the pitch, so that the game, the leaders in the game can then say, right, actually, this isn't about tokenism. This is about real world getting the best people for the job. So getting the data together, did it surprise me? Not really. I mean, you can see on the pitch how many black players there are, and you can look at the dugout and you can't see many black players there. And also there's the stories of former players and former coaches and so on who talk about their challenges getting roles. So it's actually out there, but no one has invested as we had to invest in crunching the data and putting the data together to tell the story, so that there's no question there as to why this is a problem. So Stefan, with his wonderful modeling and his wonderful team, allowed us to get to the point where we can now say, and this is a few years ago, so it's probably changed since, 43% of the players in the Premier League are black, 34% in the English Football League. We can now say that those roles that go to former players, only 4% go to black former players. And we can also say that in the leadership roles, that 1% of those roles are occupied by black people. So we're good enough to be entertainers, but not good enough to be leaders. And that's amplified by the fact that more and more black players are getting their pro license, and they're also getting their UEFA licenses. So the idea that they are qualified and therefore that's the problem is an issue, right? Because actually they are qualified. I mean, where there might be a question mark is, well, they don't apply for roles. And I say to people, well, I don't know the answer to that, because I need to do some more digging as to whether they do apply for roles. But the impression I get from those who've been in the game a long time is that they apply for roles. But as we all know, it's not actually about applying for roles. It's who you know and how comfortable people are with you. But also, I do talk to players who have applied for many roles and not got any feedback, right? And I do know players who, when they do go into the system, they find that the system actually boots them out without giving them an interview. So eventually, we're all human, right? You find yourself in a position where your name's not down, you're not getting in, right? And that again is a indication as to some of the structural issues in the game. We will put talent scouts out there to get the best players through the door. We've seen at Arsenal with the young fella who's coming at 15. We've seen at Liverpool with their young 16. You will go out there and scout rigorously for the best players. But unfortunately, when it comes to the leadership team and the board team, that doesn't seem to be the case. And certainly for coaches and managers, when we've crunched that data, when black coaches perform as well as white coaches, if not better, they are still 41% more likely to get the sack than their peers. So, it's not a case of crunching data, which then just feeds into the emotion. It's actually crunching data that is there. We're happy to share it. We're happy to analyze it with whoever, to provide that pathway that allows the talent, the pipeline that already exists. This idea we need to create a talent pipeline. The talent is there. Let's get them through. Let's give them opportunity. Let them fail as well as succeed. We all know, and again, come back to the players on the pitch. It doesn't matter what color or creed you are. It doesn't matter what gender you are, what sex you are. When you play that game and you sign a year's contract or a 3 years contract or a 5 years contract, if you're not good, you're used to being told you're not good. Off you go. Bye. If you're great, you get a renewed contract. That is the world these footballers are brought up in. So they're used to being coaches and managers who are again told, you're not good enough, your name's not down, you're not going to get the job. They're used to that. But what they're not seeing is a meritocratic society off the pitch. What they're seeing is, sorry guys, can't give you anything. If we can, it's not going to be the greatest job in the world, but be satisfied. And one day we might let you through. The data, which the boardroom should be looking at, we have. And if that's the data that they're not willing to look at, then there is a leadership issue in football. And if the leadership in football, however, is willing to look at the data, then they'll find that the game will grow, because the black coaches and black managers, when they're in roles, their points per game and yet at the moment they're not getting that opportunity.
Yeah, it seems a bit of a strange argument if the argument was that they aren't applying for roles, seeming nobody's going through all the qualifications and the coaching badges and getting their UEFA license not to ultimately become a football manager or a head coach or whatever. Like that argument for me is like, if it seems completely almost redundant. So if an argument being put back, I don't know how anyone sort of buys into that argument.
Well, this is the power structure in the game, right? You get football who don't look like me. You get the broadcasters that often don't look like me, right? And what they do is, and then there's a whole group around that. And what they do is they have this self-fulfilling prophecy around, well, they don't want the jobs, and they echo that. It's like an echo chamber. They don't want it, don't get it. They're not resilient enough. All of that, right? And these things have happened over many years and so on. And therefore, when a black player or an advocate or someone who's just fair-minded, it doesn't have to be a black person, says, actually, are we getting the right people through? They look for the excuse as to why it's not happening rather than being on the front foot for what that change might look like. And I think that's one of the things that I've found quite disappointing. Very defensive in the game when it comes to these issues, but actually not very much on the front foot when the solutions will become a lot clearer once you look at the data and engage the players in terms of what that future might look like.
When it comes to changing this echo chamber, when obviously you've got this active feedback loop within the current system, and you're speaking to these executives and you're trying to explain the numbers, trying to influence governance and how structures are set up within these organizations. What are the first steps that a football club or a sort of body needs to take in order to actually make a tangible difference off the pitch and improving this scenario? I suppose, like you say, the first issue is if they actually agree with the fact that there's a problem to begin with. I suppose that's sort of step one, right?
It is. I mean, look, you got to mean it. Culturally, you've got to be set up for it. You've got to be open-minded about it. You've got to realize that, we've changed as a footballing ecosystem from what it was to where we are. I mean, look at the England team in 1966. Look at the England team now, right? We have changed. So you've got to get to that point. But I think part of it might be as simple as, if you really believe in football as a family, how would you treat your family, your young son, your young daughter, who wants to come through the system and play the game and then have a roll off the game, right? Because if you think of it in those simple terms, and you really look at footballers who you've brought into the game maybe from the age of 8 all the way up to 38 maybe, right? So they've been in the system for 30 years. They are your family. You know them probably better than they know themselves. If you look at it in that way, then you might start thinking, actually, this guy has put his neck on the line for me. And he's shown himself to be a professional. He's shown himself to do something in a game that no one else or very few people out there have been able to do. I need to think how it is that I support them. So it involves, their coaches, it involves their agents, it involves their family members, it involves the club, it involves the institutions around the club, it involves policy, it involves a whole set of people involved in that systemic side of football to say it's no longer about optics or just about optics. It's also about the system and the structures. And once you then get that change in mindset, where you actually are saying to Antoine Simonia, at Bournemouth, you've just suffered racial abuse. Tills before him at Spurs, you've suffered racial abuse. Jess Carter, England, you've suffered racial abuse. Till they realize that it is not just about the messaging that they provide to fans, both in the stadium and out the stadium and online. It's not just about Google and Facebook and Meta, but actually they have to own their own area. They have control over who plays, who gets jobs, who succeeds, who fails. They have ownership on those management jobs, those coaching jobs, and the leader's job. They have ownership in that particular structure. So instead of passing the baton on to outside organizations, which have issues, don't get me wrong, sort you out, get your own house in order first. When you get your own house in order, you'll find that everyone else will follow. But what they very cleverly do, because, a lot of footballers, they're very proud people, black and white. What they're used to is meritocracy, 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 meritocracy. So when you talk to them at 18 and then at 28, their assumption is, of course, I'm going to get a job in football if I'm good enough as a coach and as a manager, because I share a changing room with these guys who are English, white English, black English, from the Caribbean, from Africa, from Eastern Europe and so on, and America, right? We share the changing room because we're good enough to be in the changing room. And then we'll go for jobs because we're good enough to go for jobs. So they have this meritocratic feel. The time when the penny often drops is when they've left the game, they've gone away for a year or two or got their badges, and then they're trying for jobs. And then suddenly they realize when they knock the door, their name's not down, they're not getting in, right? So it takes them a generation to realize it's not changing for them. And it's very sad to see, really, that they go away, they get the badges, they get their MBAs, they get their various qualifications, and they're just not getting those roles.
It's absolutely awful. When it comes to making these changes, then, do you believe there needs to be mandatory code brought in by the new regulator? The clubs have to take ownership, and the people who are in charge of making those decisions ultimately need to be assessing what's going on
Yeah.
and making changes for themselves. It shouldn't have to rely on external codes coming in, or unfortunately, based on the current evidence, it
Yeah.
might take these mandatory codes, these mandatory governance structures to be applied onto clubs. How do you see, so working with the regulator, what sort of mandatory codes would we be talking about that would actually make the change needed possible in football?
I mean, you, Josh, and your team are very good at scrutinizing FPP and the financial issues, right? Imagine you did the similar auditing and checks on these issues, okay? Then you'd find that would be in a very different place. If you then looked at the data and you crunched it and you had limits and you said, well, you know what, you've exceeded your limits or you've not got anywhere near it and there's a punishment for it and it impacts competition and so on, they'd soon change their tune. And it's a simple one, actually. If you said to them, you just got to choose the best people for the jobs and you have to have the right people in your organizations to help you do that, then who's going to argue against that? You know, we're in a very strange political environment, both here and across the Atlantic, or maybe it's not strange to some people, it's how it should be. But everyone's very consistent on, yeah, we should employ the best people for the job. In sport, you can see who the best people for the jobs are. You've got the data, you've got the data points. So independent scrutiny can work. Independent football regulator should be able to work. What powers it has in terms of legislation, yeah, negligible, right? But it's just starting out. It's going to have to reach out to the clubs. It's going to have to establish itself in terms of where it sits vis-a-vis the FA and the Premier League and English Football League and various other bodies. So it's going to take a while for it to get itself together. And, you know, I don't think the government really wants to run football, right? It wants the game, particularly the Premier League, you know, to continue to grow and be an important part of this nation's soft power. And I get that. But equally, if you set up an independent football regulator through the lens of the fans, and the fans want clubs that are properly run, they want clubs that are fair to both them and the communities that they come from. And you want fans who want the best players on the pitch, therefore you want the best managers and coaches to choose the best players on the pitch. You've got to have some involvement and some education for the game and also some auditing in place in order to get the game in a better spot. And that's, I think, going to require the independent football regulator. We, you know, it seems clear on who the chair is. We know who the CEO is. Well, let's see if they actually recruit any black senior staff, black senior non-execs, right? Let's see where they get to. Because if they don't, it's just more of the same. And unfortunately for fans, then they're going to be in a similar position, not too far away from where we are now, where they'll be saying, well, what's actually changed? And the game will be saying, what are we paying for? You know, the IFR is on notice, really. You know who you got your statutory objectives, know who you are, get the right people in place, get ready for cultural change, both within your institution, where it's your form, but also in the game. It's about building trust, but it's actually being held to account yourselves as well as the game in order to make sure everyone is given an opportunity and a chance, and that we have an inclusive forum for fans and communities, and also for black players who are being let down by the system.
I really like your comparison to the financial regs, because obviously that's I would, and I understand that. And I can also see like how regulation also causes urgency and actually makes change. Like, but without the financial regulations, clubs would just run unsustainably and however they wanted and spend ridiculous money and put clubs under crazy financial risk. And even with the current regulations, clubs still do that. I mean, we've seen what's going on with Sheffield Wednesday, what's happened with
Yes.
Morecambe recently.
Yes.
Like, even with regulations, there's still problems, but without those regulations, there'll be even more widespread issues.
Absolutely.
And like you say, with regulations coming into play to monitor the issue of diversity off the pitch and making sure that players are given chances, I'm certain that would create urgency at clubs to actually make change, because now there's penalties associated to that. The only worry I see with this is, how do we make sure that it's not a sort of a box ticking exercise and
Mhm.
actual a cultural change? Like, how do we sort of measure and differentiate between the two?
Yeah, so look, the game, I say it's grown exponentially, right, in terms of its global impact. And in that board pack, they'll be ticking various boxes around, financial performance, HR and remuneration. There'll be, legal risks and all these other things, right? So, there are all those issues which the regulator can have some involvement in, right? So that when clubs are doing their board meeting, they will look at the IFR's issues as part of its risk register, right? And that's quite important. But I think, there are international comparisons here that we should be looking at. And we've started doing some of that work. So you've got 40% of, if not more now, the owners in the Premier League. And I'm sorry to focus on the Premier League because it is happening elsewhere, are from the United States. I was listening to another podcast a few days ago, and there's a player called Larry Nance Jr. who plays for Cleveland Cavaliers in basketball, the NBA. And I hadn't known this, but he's now a minority owner at Leeds United. Black players are in the NBA are now at Leeds United, at Liverpool, and there are others who are having minority ownership elsewhere. And I think there's some learnings to be had around, well, why is it in the NBA approximately 50% of the coaches are black, right? Assistant coaches, 50% of the coaches roughly are black. General managers, around 40% are black. There's more ownership in those areas, right? Why is it that others seem to be able to do it and we seem not to? And I think we say that when proportionately the numbers are the same in terms of percent playing the respective sports compared to population size. And I think when you start doing work like that, you begin to then look at what you might call that organic shift from ticking a box to actually, how did they get there? What did he look like? To what extent are we doing that over here? Is it about their college system? Is it not about their college system? Is it about the type of owners we've got? Is it about who sponsors and why they sponsor the various games and what pressure they put on the game to be more inclusive and more diverse, right? We used to have this talk about, CSR, corporate social responsibility. Then we had ESG, the environmental, the societal and the governance bit. But again, there seems to be a bit of shift on this globally because of the politics. But, in terms of certain brands' involvement in sport, some of these things hold dear, right? Because the population watching the Premier League isn't just our wonderful people in the United Kingdom of 60 odd million. It's billions of people around the world, right? Of all persuasions, of all colours, who are buying the kit, who are buying the merchandise more broadly and so on. So I think when you say the tick box, well, let's do some international comparison work. Let's get a better understanding of how things have changed. Let's get an understanding of the leadership, because I think it does boil down to leadership. And let's get an understanding of how these things filter down, right? And I think it's, from my perspective, I'm conscious that I'm on here talking about what the game could do and why it should do it. For good or ill, I've worked on the corporate side, I've worked in the consultancy side, I've worked in the charitable side, I've worked in the political side, I've worked at senior levels, and I've got to know some very interesting people. And to me, it's not just about us talking about this on our own. It has to be that key word in our name, which is that partnership bit, to get to that transformation stage. At the moment, it does feel like the game is running to those who will not put pressure on them, who will not necessarily produce the data, who will talk more about the moral side rather than the business case. And I think actually you have to bring the business case to this, because no player gets put on the pitch unless they're going to achieve results. No coach gets to manage unless they're going to produce results. And that's what this work that we do is about, crunching the data. If these black guys, what women who are coming through the game are not good enough, sorry guys, you don't deserve a job, right? Or keep working harder, keep training, keep getting the qualifications, keep getting the experience, and then you can push through. But what we're doing is we're crunching the data to say, well, actually, this side of the equation looks a lot better than that side of the equation, which is the leadership side and the recruitment side and the structural side and the governance side and so on. And saying, come on, guys, let's pull together.
Yeah, I mean, it makes absolute sense. I think one of the interesting things that you've sort of shone a light on there is the fact that you mentioned the NBA, how they've gone through this transition already, if you like, because I imagine, and again, I don't have the statistics, but this has been a transition that's happened, say, over the last 10, 15, 20
Yes.
years, where you've seen more better representation off the pitch. So, learning from organizations, sporting organizations that are very sort of applicable to what is happening in our game, there's no reason why that transition can't also be applied in lessons learned. I mean, we had that within the independent, we just created the club financial reporting unit within the EFL. One of the things that we wanted to do is look at what F1 are doing, because F1's
Yeah.
financial regulations are really tight and really well written. So it's because, okay, what can we learn from F1? And again, obviously, a similar thing can be applied here. What can we learn from the NBA? Is there anything from initial research that you've seen, or is it a case of these are the questions we need to start asking? This is sort of the next stages to this.
Yeah, so this is kind of like the next stages to it. We have started a bit of the work, but we're now looking for funding partners and so on who are very interested in it. We're very keen to look at not just the NBA, but the NFL. And, the NFL has had its issues and we've known them around Colin Kaepernick and all of that. But actually, in some ways, it's recruiting more black coaches. And therefore, there are lessons to be learned across those three main sports, I would say. And we've kind of enlisted the academics, and now we just need the partners who really want to get into the heart of the problem to understand what the solutions are. But I come back to it, Josh, what we talked about near the beginning. Why is a little group like ours having to do all this work? I mean, it's just mad. If you think of all the money in football and all the money they spend on various initiatives and all the money they spend recruiting lobbyists and various other people, and I have to say, I used to work on that side of things and how much these things cost. It's almost like they're doing that to stand still, and they're doing it to create a culture of, and say, the optics and the messaging of change around their marketing initiative. When actually, if they just invested half of that, some money in the work that we do and organizations like ourselves do, you're actually moving the game forward. We have no interest, and our members have no interest in doing down the game of football, not least because a lot of them are pundits, right, where they get the jobs. They need football. It's in their blood. So for them, it's just about moving the game forward. But for some reason, and it comes to the heart of one of the problems, culturally within the game, I think they struggle to see difference as a positive, right? Challenge as a positive on these issues, which is weird because, again, when I sit in the boardroom, I get challenged all the time, or we challenge people all the time so that we understand what the risks are year 1, year 3, year 5, and then we mitigate those risks and we try and turn those risks into opportunities. In football, it seems like they just want to bury it. Right? Bury all of that. Let's not talk about it. Let's do these soft things. And in some ways you can see why. I mean, look, footballers, wonderful as they are, they just want to play the game, right? So if you are leaders in the game, then you don't have to engage with them because they don't want to play the game. You don't think you have to engage in the strategic side and, as I say, the risks and the opportunities. So we come along and go, well, okay, let's have the conversation about strategy, risk, and opportunities. They go, oh, the bloody hell, we've never had to do this. We don't want to do it, right? And that's the worrying bit. They struggle with this idea of actually this might be useful for them. And I say to people, we may not meet in the middle, because we recognize this is often about evolution rather than revolution, but at least start the conversation. There are senior people in football that have got this DEI role. I have to say I struggle with EDI, right? Because, as you say, the data that we do is about best people for the role. But okay, they've got these DEI or EDI, equity, diversity, and inclusion roles, who've never proactively come out to meet us. And you just wonder, again, it's about how do I, and no disrespect to them, because I'm sure they're great at what they do, and maybe the problem is ours. But, they're in these roles, and it's almost like, actually, we've got to be careful because we need to preserve our roles. We don't want to bring challenge into the organization, which brings risk then that we may not remain in the roles, right? But, we're here, we're producing data, we're working with the best people. But, yeah, it's a bit sad. It is a bit sad, really, because, someone who's come from outside football in many ways to then have these conversations, to find football running away from them. And as I say, October, Black History Month, they'll all be out there with their banners and their we want to change that culture around racism online often, not necessarily elsewhere. And you just think to yourself, guys and ladies, it doesn't take much, right, to start this work and partnership and start building out and then get yourselves in a better position. So we live in hope, right? But we'll continue to produce the work. We've got more work that we're doing over the next couple of months, and hopefully that will help with some of the business risks that these clubs face, both in the Premier League and the EFL.
Yeah, I think one of the key things there about optics is an issue massively in the game. That people understand that if they can control the optics and how it's perceived, and it looks like they're making progress in all issues, then it's okay because it's the public perception is reality in certain extent. And that was one of the I throw them under a bus a little bit here. This, not necessarily just to do with this issue, but that was one of the gripes within the EFL, that the comms department was so heavily loaded compared to like the other departments that needed resource to execute on jobs. It was like there was always recruitment and a large resource to the comms team because they know that, controlling the comms, controlling the perception of what's going out to the public is really key, and it is key. So I do think comms should be supported and stuff. I'm not. This isn't.
I'll do myself out of a job if you start taking comms, right? I mean, I've been doing comms for a long while, right? But I think you've kind of hit, quite an important issue on the head here. The game hates embarrassment. Leaders hate being embarrassed, right? So that's why the comms is very important, because after every game now, you've got up to 60 million publishers on social media criticizing and so on, right? And also now they're in a complicated environment because, politically there's all these shifts going on. What you find, which is quite telling, which is why football matters perhaps more than in most areas. In football, I'd say 90%, if not more, of the plus of the fans aren't black, but they celebrate. When you put that ball in the back of the net, they celebrate you as part of the family, right? So you actually have a vehicle in football where no matter what's happening politically, there is a mentality around the game that you work hard, you do your best, you show that you're talented, you show that you're worthy of your salary, we'll back you, right? And isn't that a wonderful message to send out beyond football, that these millions of people that watch the game, who are there for all these key indicators, are basically saying, we just want the best people for the work. You show hard work, willing, loyalty to the badge, whatever, we'll support you, right? I don't think that's a bad message. Actually, the club's getting reward because of the points per game, and actually the fans are getting reward because they're seeing better players, and those who aren't so good will be on the bench compared to playing. And the black players are winning because they know what the metrics are. Do well, you get a job.
Yeah, I think that's one of the key points there is the better you understand the performance metrics, the better you can hire and recruit. And I think this applies across all industries.
Absolutely.
Football and sport is so heavily scrutinized and on performance, and the betting industry has had such an influence over statistics in football because they're the ones that need to understand the likelihood of outcome in order to make sure that they get their odds correct. And that's where you've seen sort of like the Tony Blooms and the sort of Brighton model. Actually, they came from a betting background because of how heavily the gambling and betting understand the importance of these KPIs and these statistics. And I think if you can apply that methodology, that approach to off the pitch in all aspects of your business, you're going to improve performance. And I think when you do that, that also will naturally allow those who are more talented to get to the top.
Yeah, if not better. So what you say about the betting industry, right? Because I mean, both at Brentford and at Brighton, right? They got two owners who are very much data driven, love it, love the data. We love the data, right? Because that's the world we're in. So for us, it's great. But of course, we realize there's a context around the data, right? If it was just about data, then the game would be run by perhaps people like my daughter who studies maths, right? That would be a lot of those people. But there is that wider ecosystem around, the broader economics, the political stuff, the social stuff. Yeah, there's a whole number of things that go into who running a club, who's employed by a club and various other things. There's a lack of transparency around those issues, which then leads to the frustration around, well, actually, I'm good enough. Why am I getting those roles? And therefore, why is there a lack of transparency in terms of communicating who gets those jobs and who doesn't get those jobs? And I think that these are some of the challenges which, again, the game at board level don't appear to be having. And if they do, they're not telling us. And that might be an opportunity for the independent football regulator if they employ the right people. In order to then challenge and just have that conversation. I think they, we'll see, but they struggle. And I think, I don't know, we have a crisis in leadership generally in life because, my personal view, because suddenly social media means you say something and you've got all these people against you, right? So it leads to the need to have a very clear vision, mission, values in place so that when you are challenged, you are very clear in talking about why you're doing something, how you're doing something, or what the end outcome would be. And I think that level of understanding around those key areas is probably lacking in some of our leadership because it's something they struggle to get their head around. What does a mission mean? What do you mean by vision? What do you mean by values? I mean, I just want to earn money, or I want to just do X, Y, and Z. And that's some of the harder things for people to understand, which is when you go back to your comms people, if you have strategic people in those roles, not just comms people, you can actually help the owner and his team understand the real strategic messaging, strategic positioning, or strategic purpose, which then, is about the whole club and how it fits into communities and much wider that in terms of globally. And I think, for example, you mentioned Sheffield Wednesday. Who knows what goes on behind closed doors, but it seems the fans are actually calling out for that. Some clarity around who you own the club. Give us some clarity now about your mission, your vision, your values. Where do you see it going in the next, what are you doing now? What's the next year, 3 years, 5 years look like? Give us that sense of who you are so that we can be reassured that you're the right custodian for the club. And I think that is perhaps what people want from the top of the Premier League to the lower levels, and it's missing.
Just before we wrap up, as you've just mentioned it there, I'd really like to just end on, if we were to sit back down in 3, 5, 10 years, whatever, what do you see the next stages for the Block Players Partnership?
It's one of those most difficult things, right? I mean, arguably, you'd say, well, if there's 43% on the players on the pitch, you want 43% of coaches, managers, and so on to be off the pitch. And that's kind of what's happening in the NBA. And I think that, it's a fair goal to aim for. But I think, in simple terms, dear game, my line to you is base it on performance, base it on getting the actual results, and look at that within your concept of reputation. And then look at that within the concept of what helps communities, those fans, and those fans in the stadium, those people outside the stadium, and those who are watching on television. Give them a sense that, you know what, our club is the best run club possible. Our league is the best run league possible. So when you get that, then everyone can feel great. You're not waiting for the next incident of racial abuse to then have, gosh, we need to do more No Room for Racism campaign, because actually you've got your own house in order. Get your own house in order. Get the data right. Get people talking about opportunity in football in the way in which you would want for your friends and family. And then in 5 years' time or 10 years' time, when we look back at this interview, Josh, we're going, do you know what? The game listened. Actually, it probably doesn't need a regulator on these issues anymore because the game and the clubs are getting on with it, engaging with the right people, engaging with the right partnerships. Yes, there's a role for optics, but optics, there's no substitution for the system and the structure. Let's do that right.
I think that's an absolutely fantastic message to end on. Thank you so much for your time this morning, Dalroy. Thank everybody for listening as well. If you are interested in networking with myself and Dalroy, we'll be hosting a live call within the community. Link will be in description below. Thanks again for watching. And again, thanks, Dalroy, for your time.
Thanks for having me.
Brilliant. Thank you.